Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where every other week we host national thought leaders to discuss how spouses can partner to manage money and live happier lives. Today we welcome Dr. Michael Thomas, who's going to focus on closing the behavior gaps of managing money with your spouse. Enjoy the podcast.
So today, Christian, Dr. Ross, and I are thrilled to host Dr. Michael Thomas, who's an award-winning professor at the University of Georgia who teaches financial planning, housing, and consumer economics. We're going to discuss how a couple's well-planned financial plan can fall flat on its face and what can be done about it. So first, thank you for being with us today, Dr. Thomas.
I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be along for the ride.
Well, let's start by sharing with our listeners what drives your passion to teach your students how to work with their future spouses to manage money.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think first, it's just recognizing that when understanding financial literacy, oftentimes we teach it in a silo, meaning that as an individual, this is how I manage my money. As an individual, this is how I budget or create a spending plan. As an individual, this is how I invest. It's very individualistic in nature in a way that we have these conversations. So to me, there's no one, it's almost like we're socializing people to think about these things from an individualistic perspective and not step back and start to think about the nuances of what happens when you interact two individuals who can have very different backgrounds, very different emotional connections to money, different ideas about what we want for the future, what we want for our household, what we want for our children, notions about debt, whether someone is okay with leveraging debt because we're going to pay it off at the end of the month and we're going to get all of these bonus points that we can utilize to pay for a trip or pay for Christmas gifts at the end of the year, and somebody who could be vehemently opposed to the notion of leveraging debt anyway, even if it's done sensibly. So one of the things that I infuse into my intro to personal finance class, because I don't feel like enough has been done. A lot has been done in the literature, but the literature has to hit the ground, right? Where we then take that information and inform individuals early enough to let them know that this process is bigger than you. And that when you engage in relationship, there's a certain level of empathy and compassion and being intentional and understanding that just like there are love languages in terms of the way people interact with one another, we can even say that there are money love languages in a way that people feel safe and secure, respected in the way that resources are being used. But we have to be intentional about what those things are and being able to unpack these money stories in a way where you can be transformed and engage in this process of now forming this new money story that's a collective money story, as opposed to this is just a way how I think about it. You need to acquiesce to my needs, or this is the way that I think about it. You need to acquiesce to my needs. Or even if somebody's doing something, it's like, well, why are you doing this? I don't understand, because we're just so focused on the line item and the number that we don't really understand that that person who might have gotten the PlayStation 5 subscription to the upcoming Street Fighter that's going to be coming out, that might be their way of decompressing and handling and mitigating stress because they found that in video games. So if I don't understand that about my partner or my spouse, I really can't read the room in a way to really understand the story behind the behavior. And if I don't understand the story behind the behavior and a behavior that they've probably been doing since childhood and is not going to change right away, then my default mechanism is just to go back to the line item and the agreement that we made and not understand these other behavioral and emotional causes as to why someone may respond under duress, stress, uncertainty, fear, anxiousness. It can be a lot of different things. So for me, in terms of having these conversations, I try to challenge students every step of the way in everything that we talk about in our content is not just how you understand it individually, But now, how do you engage in a process of being able to actively listen to create systems that work for both of you and extend each other enough grace to know that it's not going to be perfect. It's going to take some time to build this thing together, and to have appropriate expectations of what this looks like. Because then if we don't, then it just becomes a power struggle. And it's not really about the needs of the other person, which is truly what love is, right? Love in its traditional sense is what I am willing to give of myself, not what I'm willing to receive from someone else. And I'll be honest with you, every time that I watch a YouTube or social media type thing where somebody says, "Oh, do you love your boyfriend?" or "Yeah, he takes care of me," or "She does X, Y, and Z for me," right? And that's not really the essence of love. Love is what I'm willing to give, not necessarily what I'm willing to receive. But what happens is it does become, I'm not getting what I need, as opposed to thinking about the needs of one another and trying to fill those needs and fill that void with, again, grace and compassion and respect. And so I try to drive that home simply because I feel like that is a conversation that's missing in the context of thinking about financial literacy, is not just how you engage in this process as an individual. Now, what will this process look like as a couple? Here are the barriers. Now let's start thinking about what the research says or what the literature says and what's proven to be effective ways to engage in these barriers that you are going to engage with at some point in time, and how to think effectively now about having the resources and tools to handle those things when they arise. And I tell everybody, I completely understand if this makes no sense to you right now. I get it. It's not going to make any sense to you right now, but eventually, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years down the line, you're going to sit back and you say, Dr. Thomas told me so. And then not only that, you're going to say, but we also worked through how I could work through this barrier in a loving, caring, and sensitive way.
That's so true. Everything you're just saying, Michael. You're clearly an awesome professor. I am wondering, just kind of along those lines and thinking in regards to our listeners out there, parents, family members, guardians that have young adults, emerging adults coming up, and they want to teach them a little bit more about money. Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges that maybe you've experienced in teaching personal finance topics, or teaching about some of these money relational topics that you've encountered, that you've had to overcome, and that you can suggest to those that are listening with young adults in their lives?
Absolutely. The beautiful thing, and I've learned this with my children, right? They don't care that I have a doctoral degree. They don't care that I spend a lot of my time.
They don't call you Dr. Thomas at home?
No, they don't. No. They don't care. So if I sit down and I talk to my oldest about, I have this idea that we use in our household, is called "Yep, sir," right? So it's, you're responsible. So you have to take ownership of the way that you engage with money. So it starts with you. You have to own it. And then before you can spend, plan, give, you got to earn it, because I'm not giving it to you, right? When they get older, right? So you know that you have to earn your experiences. If you want to, after school, go to Chick-fil-A and have money, guess what? You got to earn it. You have to be thinking ahead and be making money, right? Then we go into this process of thinking about, how do we then plan for our resources? And for us, we think about savings, we think about giving, we think about investing, we think about all these other different things, right? And then we have this process where we go through like reflection and be thinking about, all right, if I didn't manage my money well, what was it about this week that caused for me to maybe overspend a little bit? Was it peer pressure? Was it friends? Was it trying to live up to an expectation? And then allowing for them just to have the safe space to explore those things, and ultimately know that I'm not going to judge you for it. Guess what? We learn from it. And then we have next week to do a little bit better, but I'm not going to cover your shortfall. So So you're gonna have to earn a little bit more to cover your shortfall. So now you can have more money to do X, Y, and Z. Because I would rather them, if they're gonna fail, I would rather them fail miserably with $20 or $50 than and I've had students who've mismanaged a $50,000 windfall, all gone within a matter of a few weeks because they engaged in a risky investment that they shouldn't have engaged in. And if somebody was rushing them, right? It's like, it's unfortunate. So I know that my boys don't listen to me. So what I've realized is that we actually need community of other individuals who think and understand things the same way that we do, so that they can be delivering those same messages. So if Tristan doesn't hear me, I know that we have people within our social network that hold similar values. And if it's not coming from me, all the better, right? So I've given up on feeling like it's my sole responsibility to make sure that my child understands and knows everything about life. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to prove to me that they can do life without me, right? And it's not a negative thing. It's just them coming into their own and just wanting to say, Dad, I got it. And I get that. So we have a network of individuals and people that we trust and we know that have similar conversations about these things. And we lean into that. And then also they go to camps and all that jazz that help out with that, just in the same way that when parents send their kids to the University of Georgia and they're taking my class, a lot of the stuff they've heard before from their parents. Some of the stuff isn't new. But for whatever reason, when they hear it from me, it's like, oh, this is life-changing. This is so amazing. And I'm like, you know what? Your parents have probably told you this. So I just want you to stop and just text them really quickly and say, I apologize, right? You've been telling me the right thing the entire time. I just couldn't hear it from you. So that's one big piece. And then the other big piece is do as I say. I wrote this poem when I was younger. All right. Horrible poem, but this was my feeling. Do as I say, not as I do, are my parents' rules, a fool's rule in my point of view. And what I meant by that is that oftentimes we want to tell our kids, hey, you need to do this, you need to be doing that, but we're not modeling it, right? Yeah. Which means that if we're not modeling it, we haven't learned how to deal with the barriers in between in order to get from A to B. And if I don't know how to deal with those intermediate barriers, which really are the crux of why people don't get there, it's not just this linear, I have information, I just get there and everything's going to be great. It's usually because that there are these little barriers in between. And then what happens is that there's dissonance between what my parent is doing versus what they're telling me. And then when they start engaging in a process themselves and are trying to do the right thing, guess what? Nobody showed them how to deal with the individual barriers in between to actually navigate the process in full to complete the journey. And then they become stuck, and then they can't go back to mom and dad and say, well, how do I get there? Because mom and dad don't really know how to get there. Yeah. They have information. They know theoretically what the right thing to do is, but behaviorally and actionably haven't been able to navigate the process consistently enough to actually yield fruit. And then if you do that long enough, that becomes culture. And there becomes a narrative, and then there becomes a story, right? And then it just becomes, hey, we don't do this because it doesn't work. But we don't unpack why it didn't work and be vulnerable enough to explain that we just didn't have the tools or the capacity or the know-how or the financial stability to effectively operationalize said thing. So for me, it would be just being very intentional about the things that you are able to do. Granted, there are going to be things that you may not have the capacity to do, but don't set an expectation for that if it's going to end in a negative result. How about let's focus on the things that you are able to do well financially, that you are able to model, that you are able to walk them through. And I would argue that all of us have at least one thing that we do well. So let's use that one thing as the basis for building successful habits, right? And then in areas where I don't have them and I can't model them, Then let's connect with other people who are modeling. So now we have community and systems and say, hey, I'm not there, but so-and-so is. You can learn something from them. I can learn something from them, and we can both grow together. So there's a vulnerability element of this because as parents, we don't have it all figured out. And unfortunately, most students figure that out by the time that parents have to start completing the FAFSA. A lot of things come out of the woodwork when you got to file your taxes and you got to send that stuff to federal student aid, things of that nature, or to an institution. Oh, I haven't paid taxes in a few years, right? There's a lot because we start to now become more and more enmeshed in not the idea of our parent, but actually understanding who they are, and they're human. And it's okay to be human. It's okay not to have it all together. The issue is that when we do, and we can't consistently model the things that we hope to model, then what it does is it creates a roadblock in somebody's mind that says, oh, this is ideal, but nobody in my family ever achieves it, right? And then after a while, if you hear that from your uncles and aunts and so on and so on and so forth, then after a while, it's kind of like it becomes futile to even try or to put forth the energy and the effort. So those would be some of the big things that I would say. Leverage and utilize community as best as we can. Allow yourselves to be vulnerable, to know what you don't know, but then also to celebrate the things that you do know, and try to ensure that there's some consistency with what you're saying and what you're modeling. So it's when a child sees you, there's consistency there. And I think that that's incredibly important, especially with youth that are trying to figure out things on their own. To effectively model, I think it's so incredibly important.
Reminds me of my classroom. I'm a pretty soft-spoken person, but I got these pieces of advice from different mentors throughout my career in the classroom, describing that your students might not be listening right now, but they are listening. If that makes sense. They are watching how you contend with challenges, how you contend with obstacles. So there's a good segue into my question for you, Dr. Thomas, which is, listeners of this podcast, they might be parents, they might not be. In general, they're folks who are interested in, managing money, managing the household, a life full of experiences together. So I'd be interested to hear, what are some examples where a couple's financial plans can go wrong, and how can they contend with that?
Yeah, I think oftentimes plans go wrong because the plans are not focused on the individual. They're focused on the responsibility of managing a household. And so there's a what and there's a how we go about doing this. And the how we go about doing this is the way that we unpack the money stories, the money scripts, and all these other different things. But very rarely do I ever just have random conversations, except for like in a circle like this, where someone is sensitive to those things. The emotional and visceral response of a line item, or just the fear of a budget to begin with, because it could signal past trauma, past hurt. Individuals can have fatalistic type notions and ideas about the future. So engaging in a process of, let's say, if I'm going to have somebody say, hey, let's sit down and, plan what our future is going to look like over the course of the year, that actually can be something that can demotivate someone because they struggle with thinking about the future in a positive way because of some past situation or issue, right? And money is so directly connected to our emotions, our fears, our desires, our wants, our needs, our vulnerabilities, that within a relationship, those become landmines that we had no idea they were there, right? So in terms of navigating this relationship with someone, you're literally navigating landmines because we haven't actually gone through a process to unearth these things so that we can have the ground in which we can play and have the space to grow and develop. And so what happens is people get into relationships, they don't have these more in-depth conversations, they end up stepping on landmines. And it happens on both sides of it. And then they try to figure it out. But what happens in those instances is that because we haven't developed the tools and the capacity to engage in a very intimate way with our partners about money, then we just double down on what we've always known, right? We do more of what we've always known at some point in the past. So I think that in terms of navigating this stuff, it literally is just having opportunities to explore conversations about money, big picture, as opposed to just doing a deep dive into the nuances of a budget, right? So one of the things that I always recommend is like before, like if somebody is wanting to engage in conversations about money, go on a walk, go on some walk and talks, go on walk and talks. Like, hey, because what it does is there's actually some studies in the neuroscience space that talk about if someone is sitting at a table and then they're talking about money, they're so focused on the line items and the dollars and what this means to our present and to our future, that they're actually starting to trigger their limbic system and become more emotional about these conversations, as opposed to being able to engage in a prefrontal cortex. So what happens is that when we go on walk-in talks, it actually neutralizes the emotional response. And because we're engaging in exercise, it kind of produces endorphins, so feelings of pleasure. And because we're looking out into space in like a panoramic view, it actually even changes the way that we see things. So we're not lasered in and focused. We're actually thinking and seeing things in a broader or bigger perspective. So it actually creates an environment in space that's optimal to engage in sometimes what can be difficult conversations about money, because you have these other factors that are kind of counterbalancing your desire to be more emotional, right? And use your alligator brain in terms of navigating this space. So that's one big thing is like, don't start with the deep dive, start more generally, just like with investing. When the markets are tumultuous, they tell you to zoom out, not zoom in. So why couldn't we take that same concept and philosophy in the way that we zoom out first, big picture, and create the space and the boundaries and the canvas, so to speak, for which we'll build. And then we zoom in gradually over time, right? Because once you zoom in and you start arguing over money, it's hard to be able to come back and to create that space of, right, seeing the big picture. Now you're offended. Now you're hurt. Now you're all these different things. So I think that oftentimes we jump into the deep end and not realize that we actually don't have the capacity to have mutually beneficial conversations about money because we don't even understand our own landmines. If I don't even understand myself and I haven't explored myself in my relationship with money, even if I'm doing something behaviorally, I don't have the capacity to communicate it. I don't understand where it even came from. Like, Bruce, you know this. If we talk about CBT or whatever it may be, and you have like your experience, but you forget the experience and you've labeled it, and now that label becomes the thing that kind of influences the way that you think and emotionally respond and behave, but we forget the event that happened 20 years ago. Now we're just kind of in this loop where we're using heuristics to drive our behaviors and our thought patterns about things, and we don't know it. So if I don't know it, and my partner doesn't know it, there's no way to create symmetry here because we don't even know how to even unpack our own stories. So my biggest thing is just allowing the space to not feel as if that we just have to dive directly into the budget, to really provide space to unpack our emotions and our feelings around money so that we can develop the compassion that's going to be necessary to really engage and to stay focused on the objective and not the person and what they're doing or what they're not doing, to be able to create some sensible balance and harmony to move forward from there. Otherwise, why would someone want a budget or create a spending plan? Like, that would make no sense to me. That if every time we do this, it causes conflict, it causes strife, we're not talking to each other for 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, I would never want to engage in that process, regardless of how beneficial it could be, right? But the issue, though, is that even after you've set the budget, you still have to execute it. And if you're not able to have effective conversations to even engage in building something, you're not going to have the capacity to operate in your right mind in terms of executing, because what happens is that the budget process can create deficits. And if it creates deficits in you emotionally and psychologically, then your behavioral pattern may be, well, I feel hurt, I'm going to use money to go do what I want to do, right? Because this is what makes me feel better, despite what we agreed upon. But because I've been hurt through the budgeting process, that can actually create an emotional deficit. And we're focused on the financial surplus. But the financial surplus in a budget means nothing if the very process of it creates emotional and psychological deficits in both of the partners, because they're not going to have the desire and want to execute on this unified vision, because engaging in this process just shows us that we're not connected. We're not unified. Why would I want to build something together over the next month to work towards some goal? I'm going to fall back on my default mechanism. I'm going to prioritize me, and I'm going to make sure that I get what I want. So now this becomes transactional, right? And we can go into financial infidelity and all these other different things that are born out of this process. Let's just be honest. I don't think most people who engage in financial infidelity just do it starting out, right? It could be a behavioral pattern, but then oftentimes it's because I'm not feeling heard. I'm not feeling as if my needs are being met, so on and so forth. And I want to do the things that I want to do without my partner knowing, because they don't care about my needs. And it's very clearly evident when we navigate this process. So why would I go back to it? So that's a big thing for me when it comes to individuals who are trying to work on building the capacity to engage in an empathetic process of understanding one another. And empathy is three-tiered, right? You have cognitive empathy, is where we understand. We have affective empathy, is it when we can kind of connect to the emotional or visceral response of our partner. Even though we don't necessarily feel it, we can understand maybe a time when we felt something similar, and in why they might behave the way that they behave, so that then we have enough information to engage in a compassionate response to their needs. And if it's mutually beneficial, then we have this fertile ground where people can be vulnerable so that they can begin the process of growing, as opposed to hiding. And I say this all the time. Shame causes people to hide, and empathy encourages people to rise. I often, and I've wanted to do a study on this, is just kind of thinking about partners and whether or not they feel as if their partner is engaging in an empathetic process of wanting to understand their needs and desires as it relates to money. But you can't do that if we just focus on the numbers. We have to focus on the story of the lives of the individual. They have to understand our story and our feelings as to why that we feel certain ways. And then we have to engage in a process that takes a lot of work to build this new, right, collaborative notion of what does this look like within a context of our relationship, while being incredibly mindful of the sensibilities associated with your partner's money story, your money story, so on and so forth. But no deep dive, like zoom out first, then gradually zoom into the process. And if you find that there's a point where it causes a little bit of conflict, then guess what? You can actually say everything up to this point is good, but there's something about this moment that's causing a little bit of tension. Let's slow down a little bit. Let's unpack that so we can develop the appropriate tool to address this issue. And then we go a little bit deeper, right? And it's okay to go slow to go fast. And I think that that's the most effective way to do that as relates to couples and engaging with money, and then making it a celebration. Public space, go talk about money over some Starbucks, right? Go at Starbucks, right? Don't bring it home, right? Don't just sit around the table. Get out, go walk around. Have a glass of wine at your favorite wine shop and just talk about some small things as it relates to the budget. Try to associate engaging in this process in something that's festive, that's flowing, that there's positive energy, as opposed to we're going to sit around a dimly lit table. There's no light coming in. There's no music in the background, right? It's just quiet. It's cold. It's lifeless. It's money. I wouldn't want to deal with that, right? So it's how do we create fun and excitement around these resources so that we can be intentional about where we're going and not necessarily just be stuck on where we've been. And it's hard to do that if we don't understand each other's needs, because then we're just stuck in a rut, as opposed to this process is a way of considering how, as a collective and as individuals, we can create space to adhere to our values, to mitigate our fears and uncertainties as it relates to this process that is managing money as a household.
As you were speaking, I found myself thinking about the movie Remember the Titans. Have you ever seen Remember the Titans?
I have.
I love that movie. And what's causing the connection is that a marriage is a team. And as a team, at least in 2022, you're tackling a pretty complex financial world, and you're tackling a lot of problems that are hard to take on.
Yeah.
And you have to get the team right first.
Yes.
And I go back to thinking about how in the movie that it was a challenge to bring them together. But once they had that strong bond, the nature of the problems they were facing didn't break them. They were able to work through it.
Absolutely.
And so let's take we'll just take one example of a small problem. Like in Remember the Titans, it'd be just one game. The financial world is complex, particularly around some of the tools that folks use in the financial service industry. As couples are deciding which tools to use and how to use them, what are some strategies that they can incorporate to make sure that they are protecting the big picture? They've zoomed out, they know what they want, they're on the same page, and they're using those tools to be able to accomplish the goals established on their walk and talk.
Absolutely. I think that the interesting thing about tools can provide some direction in terms of where somebody could be going potentially, but they don't always unpack the nuance of how to get there, right? I was just on bankrate.com and we were looking at mortgage calculators with my class and how mortgage interest rates are around 7.07%. Yes, which is crazy to think about.
Yes, it is.
And we're talking about just 2 years ago, we were able to refinance our mortgage loan for 2.5%.
Yeah, staggering differences.
It's a staggering difference, and that literally is 3 times more. So if you look at
be specific. What is an example when you hear 2.5 and 7%, unless you've gone through the process, you might not understand how big of a difference that is. Can you provide an example?
Yeah. So let me just kind of put it, because I think this is the best way to think about it. If we're looking at a 30-year loan, and let's say a $300,000 home, and let's say a modest 3% down payment, especially for someone who's a first-time home buyer, 2.5% and 7.0% could be the difference of close to $300,000 paid over the life of the loan.
Ooh, that is
which ultimately is going to impact someone's purchasing power, right? Because the whole notion of house rich, cash poor, I think that we are going to start hearing more and more of that conversation as you have some people who are just are still racing into the market to be able to secure a home because they don't know if rates are going to still continue to go up or not, or whatever it may be. My hope is that eventually we're going to start seeing home prices come down, which we have, but then that's dependent on market. It's not everywhere. Some places going to be hotter than other places. And then hopefully as a result, we see the Fed pivot a little bit and start actually maybe just maintaining rates or maybe coming down a little bit on these rates to provide a little bit of relief. But this is the thing that actually can cause conflict within a household. Let's say if you have one person who's kind of like, I want a house, we've never lived in a home, and this is like a family milestone to engage in home ownership. Yeah. And then you have the other partners kind of like, yeah, like this would be great, but we're going to be paying $2,500, $2,800 a month on this house. That's not including all the maintenance. That's not including utilities. That's not including all these other different things. That's going to have a very adverse effect on our cash flow. And I know that you want to take vacations. I know that you want these things or these other things, but we're just not going to have the capacity to do that, right? So what's fascinating is that when we have these tools, it can provide some clarity, but it still comes back to someone's perceptions on why they want what they want and being able to tackle that effectively, which comes back to why you have so many amazing people who work in the financial services industry and space, whether financial counselors, coaches, financial therapists, advisors, so on and so forth. So I think that the beauty of working with these types of professionals is that they allow for someone to come in objectively, consider the information delivered by the tool, understand something about the clients that they're working with, and kind of create this space to create this middle ground so it doesn't have to be an all or nothing conversation. So Brian, in a way, I'm actually very pro financial services and the spectrum of financial services, and that it's incredibly important that individuals just don't rely on tools alone, but actually work with professionals in the space, because it's not just one tool, right? Because me doing this one thing affects this thing over here. And then this thing affects this thing over here. Maybe purchasing this car too early is going to throw off my total debt to income ratio, which then ultimately is going to impact my ability to be able to secure a loan of X, Y, and Z, right? So yeah, we have these tools, but then the difficulty becomes, how do we then take those tools, and there are a lot of them, make sense of these things in such a way that work nicely within the context of our relationship. So for me, I really think it's important for individuals to lean into the financial services profession, because I think now more than ever, we have more individuals that are equipped to not just handle the technical side, but also the relational side and emotional sides of the money, right? That I think then provides a more robust process by which to understand those tools, to understand our full financial picture and capacity, and then what's going to be the most effective strategy, right, to move forward given said information, and not just using tools in isolation to say, oh, I use this calculator based on how much we earn, which could be $80,000 a year, we can get pre-approved for a $375,000 home. No. The tool said that I can get a $375,000 home. It doesn't mean that that's the optimal strategy for you and your family. And what most people do is that they engage reactively and not proactively. We do it with car loans. We do it with homes. We don't think about what the impact of having this. Do you know how many people I've worked with that wanted the home, wanted the home, wanted the home,
right,
wanted the car, wanted the car, wanted the car? They end up getting it. And this thing that was supposed to be a blessing has now become their bondage.
Yeah.
Because they relied on a tool that said you can afford, and it did not work within their financial situation. That then causes stress and strain. Now we have more conflicts around money. We can't do the things that we used to do, right? And it becomes a snowball effect. So my biggest thing is that tools are good. However, I think it's so incredibly important when making major decisions to work with a professional in this space to help you understand, because the mortgage company, their agenda is to make money. Right?
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Like, the tool is there because they want you to get another credit card.
It is
the
a business,
is there
right?
Because they want you to finance another vehicle. It's not there because it's the optimal financial strategy for you. It's for them to make more money, right? So we need to be able to our clients don't always understand that. And sometimes you need somebody to be able to pull you back a little bit and understand why we have these tools. Like Credit Karma or Experian, whenever they message me or send me a notification in my email, whatever it may be, it's always for me to get another card. It's always for me to do another.
Right. And for our listeners, I want to make sure that they understand when we're talking about financial professionals, what we're really talking about. I'll use an example, well, two. One example was, it was about a year ago at this time, I had a couple reach out to me, and he is very number driven. He's financially literate, and that drives his decisions. And she wanted a house. They were renting. They didn't have to leave. And it was probably the worst time in the history of the United States to go from a rental that was costing them next to nothing to buying a house at the absolute peak. But because they had not zoomed out and been on the same page, he simply gave in. And part of that problem was that the professionals they were listening to were the professionals who were only incentivized by selling, whether it was the realtor saying, hey, look at the housing prices. They'll just keep going up and up and up, like 2008 didn't exist. Or the lender is simply saying these rates are at historical lows. They didn't request to see, as I would suggest, somebody like yourself, a financial therapist, a financial planner who has to adhere to the fiduciary standard, somebody that they hire to make sure that their best interests are being put ahead of their own and ahead of all of the other people trying to make money on them. And they went ahead and they bought the house. And fast forward like 9 months later, it was a different couple with a similar situation. And this time the rates went way up. And so what are they hearing from the lender? Don't worry about that. They will always come down. Look, just 8 months ago, they were 2.5%. You can refinance in just a year or two. They don't know that. They don't know that. But the person who really wanted the house, they heard that from the professional. And the thought is, well, he does this for a living. He must be right.
He knows what he's talking about then.
So the suitability fiduciary standard, I don't want to get into all the minutia of that. But Bruce and I come out of the same program.
Mm-hmm.
We've, learned under the same type of individuals. And I'll be honest with you, fiduciary standard, fiduciary standard, fiduciary standard, fiduciary standard, fiduciary standard. And I'll be honest with you.
Heard it at least once a week in our program.
It's like, for us, it's a no-brainer, right? And I'll be honest with you, there's opportunity to make money, but what's the point of making money if it's not mutually beneficial? You're not putting someone else in the best position to win as well. And for me, and I know for Bruce and for you, Brian, too, that really frustrates me, because I engage in his work from the place of how I can help people, and not necessarily not from the point of what I can stand to make from people. Now, in order to be financially viable as any type of business or whatever it may be, you have to earn money, but it should never be at the cost of another family's financial well-being.
Yeah.
Money is a conduit, and there is nothing more beautiful than to think about how your impact has allowed for someone to maximize their use of money in such a way that allows for them to have peace of mind, fulfillment, joy, freedom, and all these other different things. That's the win. That's the win. And so I want to say that there are organizations, financial planning organizations, CFP, Mark, there's AFCs, there are people who are part of NAPFA and all these different things, right? There's a lot of organizations out there that adhere to a fiduciary standard and go above and beyond what that even means, because they gravitate towards these organizations because it reflects their values. It's not always just about the information, is that this is representing my values and what I believe to be a professional in a space, and how we serve individuals and clients, financial therapists, so on and so forth, through FTA, Financial Therapy Association. So you're absolutely right about this in terms of that there are people who are professionals, and I tell my students all the time, don't just trust anything that I say in this class, because if they're able to vet me, I know that they're going to develop the capacity to vet other professionals in the space, and not lend too much credence to a designation or a degree in the event that they have questions. It's not I'm just going to trust you. No, I don't want you to just trust me. I want to partner with you, and I need to be clear and certain that you understand the consequences of an action, good, bad, or indifferent, because this is something that you're going to have to live with. And I don't want you to just do it because I think it's a good thing, right? I want you to own it as well. And I just don't know any other way of being in terms of navigating this space. Because for me, this is about families. This is about community. This is actually this. I love money for that purpose, not the other way around.
Well, I don't think there's a better way to end, because we typically like to conclude with what's the message, and I feel like today what the message should be for our listeners is that the art of tackling problems and conversations with your spouse can be something that you can do together without intervention, but it's also important to recognize that if there has been financial trauma, if the strain in the relationship is a result of not being able to get on the same page when it talks in regards to managing money, find somebody who is required to put your best interests first. So it's as Dr. Thomas, you were saying, when you do your research, just make sure they have to adhere to the fiduciary standard. And if there's been financial trauma in their spousal relationships as a result, see if they have their financial therapy designation, because some folks do need that third person to be involved to help facilitate the conversation and the financial plan until they're able to get themselves together moving forward without any help. Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time today, Christian and Dr. Ross, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you.
Christian, Dr. Ross, and I thank our listeners and our guest. Please be sure to go to modernhusbands.com, where you can subscribe to our podcast. You can listen to our podcast in whatever platform you prefer: Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or even on YouTube. Until next time, be well.